The wind outside the roadside diner carried the sharp cold of early winter, rattling the glass windows every few minutes, as if something outside wanted to come in. Inside, the place was small, old, and tired, with faded booths, a long counter, and a coffee machine that had been working harder than anyone else since dawn. Bob sat in the corner booth with his back against the wall. It was a habit he never explained to anyone. People thought powerful men chose corner seats because they liked control, but for Bob, it was simpler than that. He liked seeing the door. He liked knowing who came close. And he liked having enough space to reach his crutches without looking desperate. To the world outside, Bob was an omega who had everything. He was the founder and CEO of a biotech empire that specialized in medical technology, suppressor research, and support systems for omegas whose bodies did not fit society's perfect little expectations. His company was worth billions. His name appeared in business magazines, medical panels, and investor conferences. But that morning in that diner, he was not a CEO. He was just a tired omega sitting alone with cold eggs, toast, and a strawberry milkshake he had ordered for no reason except that it reminded him of easier years. His left leg ached beneath the table. The prosthetic was advanced, expensive, and custom-built by his own company's research division, but technology could not erase every kind of pain. It could not erase phantom sensations. It could not erase the memory of being whole. And it definitely could not erase the way strangers looked at him when they noticed the crutches beside the booth. Bob reached into his coat pocket and touched the small suppressor case there. He had taken one before leaving his apartment. He had taken another in the car. Too much, his doctor would say. Dangerous, his assistant would say. Necessary, Bob would answer. Because an omega who smelled vulnerable in public was never truly safe. Across the diner, at the counter, Benjin sat hunched over a black coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. He was an alpha, though he worked hard not to feel like one. He kept his pheromones locked down, so tightly most people barely noticed him unless they were close enough to see the tension in his shoulders or the way his hand sometimes trembled around a mug. He owned a small garage 2 blocks away, the same garage his father had left behind with old tools, loyal customers, and a debt large enough to bury him. Before that, Benjin had been military. He had spent years being trained to move first, strike fast, and protect the person behind him. Then he came home with scars no one could see clearly, a nervous system that still heard danger in quiet rooms, and a belief he hated but could not shake. Alpha strength always hurt someone in the end. So he kept his head down. He fixed cars. He paid bills late. He avoided trouble. And that morning, after working through the night on an elderly customer's broken transmission, he sat in the diner trying to remember how to breathe like a normal man. Then the 2 young alphas walked in. They were loud from the moment the door opened. Too much confidence. Too much perfume layered over careless pheromones. They did not order anything at first, just slid into a booth near the entrance and scanned the room like they were looking for entertainment. Benjin noticed when their attention landed on Bob. Bob noticed too, but he did not look up. That was the first thing that made Benjin's jaw tighten. Bob had the stillness of someone who had learned that reacting only gave cruel people more to feed on. One of the young alphas leaned toward the other and spoke loudly enough for half the diner to hear. Look at the omega in the corner. Think he needs those crutches, or is that some rich person accessory? A few people looked up. Then they looked away. Bob's fingers tightened around his glass, but his face remained calm. He had built companies, faced boardrooms full of alphas who thought an omega should smile more and speak less, and survived worse than 2 boys with ugly mouths. Still, the insult landed. It always did, no matter how practiced he became at pretending it did not. Benjin told himself to stay seated. It was not his fight. He had learned the hard way that when he stepped in, people did not see a protector. They saw an alpha who moved too fast and hit too hard. They saw danger. The taller alpha stood first. His friend followed. They crossed the diner and stopped beside Bob's booth. Hey, the taller one said, smiling like cruelty was charm. We were just curious. What happened to your leg? Bob looked up slowly. That is not your business. The other one laughed. Relax. We're just asking. Omegas are so sensitive. Walk away, Bob said, his voice quiet but firm. Instead, the taller one reached down and picked up one of Bob's crutches. The diner seemed to hold its breath. Bob's expression changed. Not fear exactly, but something colder. Put that down. The young alpha swung the crutch lightly, testing its weight. Or what? You going to chase me? His friend laughed. Benjin's hand closed around his coffee mug, so hard the ceramic creaked. Bob shifted, reaching for the crutch, and that was when the taller alpha flicked his wrist and knocked the strawberry milkshake off the table. The glass shattered across the floor, pink liquid spreading between the pieces like a stain. The laughter that followed was worse than the crash. Then the young alpha slapped Bob. The sound cut through the diner like a gunshot. Bob's head turned with the force of it. His hand lifted to his cheek. For one awful second, no one moved. Then something changed in the air. Bob's suppressor failed. It started as a faint sweetness under the smell of coffee, grease, and broken glass. Then it deepened, warm and unstable, the scent of an omega pushed past control. Bob felt it the moment it happened. His breath caught. His body went rigid with panic. The other alphas in the diner reacted before they understood why. Heads turned. Shoulders tensed. The two young alphas stopped laughing. Bob's face went pale. He reached for the suppressor case in his pocket, but his fingers would not close properly. The slap, the humiliation, the shock, all of it had cracked through the chemical wall he had forced around himself. And then Benjin stood. His chair scraped back slowly, but the force that came from him was immediate. Alpha pheromone filled the diner, not wild, not uncontrolled, but heavy enough to silence every breath in the room. It pressed down like a warning. The two young alphas froze. Benjin crossed the distance in a few calm steps. "Put it down," he said. The taller one tried to sneer, but his voice shook. "Who the hell are you?" Benjin took the crutch from his hand without raising his voice. When the boy tried to pull away, Benjin caught his wrist, turned it just enough to make him drop to his knees, and stopped before pain became injury. The second boy lunged forward. Benjin moved once. The boy hit the side of the booth and stayed there, stunned, more frightened than hurt. The diner went silent again, but this time the silence belonged to Benjin. He stood between Bob and everyone else, his back broad enough to block the stares, his pheromone controlled but unmistakable. "No one," Benjin said, his voice low and steady, "is touching him again." Bob stared at him. His cheek burned. His hands shook. His pheromones were still slipping out in uneven waves, but for the first time that morning, the fear did not swallow him whole. Because this alpha was not looking at him like prey. He was not looking at him like property. He was standing in front of him like Bob was someone worth protecting. Benjin forced the two young alphas to apologize, take out their phones, and give their names. His control never broke, but Bob could see the strain in his shoulders. This was not easy for him. This alpha was holding himself back with everything he had. When the boys finally stumbled out of the diner, the bell above the door chimed too brightly for what had just happened. Benjin turned around slowly. The full force of his attention landed on Bob, and somehow it felt gentler than everything else in the room. He crouched beside the booth instead of standing over him. He placed the crutch within Bob's reach, careful not to touch him without permission. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Bob lowered his hand from his cheek. His voice came out quieter than he wanted. "I don't know." Benjin's expression tightened, not with pity, but with understanding. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have stood up sooner." Bob looked at him for a long moment. He had met powerful alphas. Rich alphas. Beautiful alphas. Dangerous alphas. Alphas who wanted to own him, use him, flatter him, or break him. But he had never met one who apologized for not protecting him fast enough. His throat felt strangely tight. "Why?" Bob asked. Benjin frowned slightly. "Why what?" Bob's fingers curled around the crutch, but his eyes stayed on Benjin. "Why did you help me?" Benjin did not answer right away. And that silence, more than anything, made Bob want to know him. Benjin did not answer immediately, and somehow that silence felt more honest than any polished excuse Bob had heard from politicians, executives, or alphas who liked pretending they were decent people. The diner had slowly returned to life around them after the two young alphas left, but the atmosphere still carried the uncomfortable weight of what everyone had witnessed. The kind of silence people hid inside when they realized they should have done something sooner and hated themselves for not moving. Benjin finally pulled back slightly from the booth, though he still stayed close enough that Bob could feel the steady pressure of alpha pheromones around him, controlled and restrained but strangely calming against the chaos still lingering inside his chest. "I helped because they were hurting you," he said quietly, like the answer should have been obvious. Someone should have stopped them before it got that far. Bob looked at him for a long moment without speaking because the strangest part was not the fact that Benjin had stepped in, It was the fact that he sounded genuinely bothered by the idea that he had acted too late instead of expecting praise for acting at all. Most alphas liked being thanked when they protected someone. Most of them wanted attention for basic decency. But this man looked almost uncomfortable sitting there beside him, like he was still replaying the scene in his head and blaming himself for every second Bob had been left alone with those boys. The waitress returned with coffee and another strawberry milkshake, setting both down carefully before hurrying away again, and Bob realized the entire diner was still watching them in small, cautious glances. He hated attention. He hated pity even more. Yet somehow the embarrassment sitting heavy in his stomach had eased slightly since Benjean moved beside him. "You didn't have to replace the milkshake," Bob murmured while wrapping both hands around the warm coffee cup. "I know," Benjean answered. "I wanted to." Something about the simplicity of that response made Bob look down at the table, because he suddenly became too aware of how exhausted he felt. The suppressor crash still lingered under his skin, leaving his body unsteady and his instincts raw in ways he hated. Usually after a pheromone disruption, he wanted distance from everyone, especially alphas, because too many of them reacted badly once they smelled weakness from an omega. But Benjean's scent felt different. Heavy, yes. Strong enough that every alpha in the diner had instinctively backed down the moment it spread through the room. Yet underneath that strength there was restraint so sharp it almost hurt to feel. Benjean kept himself controlled with the same brutal discipline Bob used on his own body. "You military?" Bob asked eventually. Benjean's fingers tightened slightly around his mug before relaxing again. "Used to be. That explains the way you moved." A faint shadow crossed Benjean's face then, not pride, not nostalgia, but something colder. "Not much use for it anymore unless someone decides to throw punches in a diner before sunrise." Bob gave a quiet hum at that, then took a sip of coffee while studying him more carefully. Up close, Benjean looked more tired than intimidating. The dark circles under his eyes were impossible to miss now, and the exhaustion in his posture looked bone-deep rather than temporary. There was grease still caught beneath his fingernails, and his flannel shirt smelled faintly of motor oil beneath the alpha scent. He did not look like the kind of alpha who spent his life trying to dominate rooms. He looked like someone surviving one day at a time. "What do you do now?" Bob asked. "I own a garage a few blocks away," Benjean replied. "Ryder Garage." The name meant nothing to Bob, but the way Benjean said it carried complicated weight behind it. "Family business?" Benjean nodded once. "Was my father's." Bob almost asked another question but stopped himself because he recognized that tone too well. Grief always sounded different depending on the person carrying it, but it still had the same sharp edges underneath. Instead he leaned back slightly in the booth, careful with his injured leg, and changed directions. "You don't seem like someone who likes trouble." A dry laugh escaped Benjean before he could stop it. "I don't. Yet you still stood up." Benjean met his gaze directly for the first time since the fight ended, and the intensity there caught Bob off guard because there was no hesitation in it anymore. "I'm an alpha," he said quietly. "If I can't stop people stronger than me from hurting someone weaker, then what exactly is the point of being one?" The words landed harder than Bob expected because they were so different from the alpha philosophy he had spent most of his life surrounded by. Strength, power, ownership instinct. Those were the things society praised in alphas. Protection usually came with conditions attached. Benjean said it like responsibility instead. Bob looked away first. For several minutes they spoke about small things that somehow never felt shallow. Benjean mentioned that business had been rough lately because people in town were struggling financially, and Bob found himself listening more closely than he intended. There was something grounding about the way this alpha talked. No performance. No manipulation. No careful social mask. Benjean spoke like someone who had forgotten how to pretend years ago. When Bob finally checked the time on his phone, he realized nearly 40 minutes had passed. His assistant had already sent multiple messages asking where he was, but for once he ignored them. "I should go," he admitted reluctantly while reaching for his crutch. Before he could properly stand, pain shot sharply through his leg, and his balance shifted dangerously sideways. Benjean caught his arm instantly. The contact lasted barely 2 seconds, but Bob's breath caught anyway. Alpha pheromones wrapped around him immediately, protective instead of possessive, steady instead of overwhelming. Benjean released him just as quickly once Bob regained balance, but the warmth of that touch lingered far longer than it should have. "Sorry," Benjean said automatically. Bob blinked once. For what? For grabbing you. Most alphas would not have apologized for touching an omega. Most would have assumed the contact was welcome simply because instinct existed. That realization settled strangely inside Bob's chest while he adjusted his grip on the crutch. You apologize a lot, he said quietly. Benjean looked faintly embarrassed by that observation. Occupational hazard. Bob almost smiled. Outside the diner, cold air swept across the parking lot as dawn slowly brightened the horizon. Benjean walked beside him without asking permission, staying close enough to help if needed, but never close enough to crowd him. It was careful, respectful. Bob could not remember the last time an alpha had treated him with that kind of instinctive consideration. When they reached the black SUV waiting near the curb, Benjean hesitated. You sure you're okay to drive? I'll survive. That's not what I asked. Bob paused halfway through opening the car door because the concern in Benjean's voice sounded painfully genuine. Not flirtation. Not obligation. Just concern. I'm fine, he said softer this time. Thank you. For earlier. Benjean gave a small nod, but before stepping away his eyes briefly lowered toward the fading red mark still visible on Bob's cheek, and something dangerous flickered behind his calm expression for the first time since leaving the diner. They shouldn't have touched you, he said quietly. The words settled heavily between them. Then Benjean stepped back, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets before turning toward the street. Bob watched him walk away longer than he should have, noticing the slight stiffness in his shoulder and the exhaustion in his posture even from behind. Only when Benjean disappeared around the corner did Bob finally slide into the driver's seat. The interior of the SUV still carried faint traces of expensive leather and suppressor chemicals, but somehow all Bob could smell was the lingering memory of cedar and smoke from Benjean's pheromones. He sat there in silence for several seconds before pulling out his phone. Then, without fully understanding why, he opened a blank note and typed 3 simple words. Benjean Ryder. Garage owner. After a brief pause, Bob added one more line beneath it. He looked at me like I was human. Part 3 stay. 3 days after the diner incident, Bob stood in front of Ryder Garage with one hand resting on his crutch while cold wind swept through the nearly empty lot, carrying the smell of gasoline, metal, and old rain across the cracked pavement. The building looked exactly like the kind of place investors ignored without hesitation. The paint along the walls had faded years ago, 2 of the garage signs flickered unevenly, and the office windows needed replacing badly enough that even from outside Bob could see tape holding one corner together. Yet despite all of that, there were still customer cars parked outside waiting for repairs, and inside the open garage bay, mechanics moved with the rhythm of people who cared about their work even while drowning in problems. Bob watched Benjean for nearly 30 seconds before stepping closer. The alpha was bent over the hood of an old truck, sleeves rolled to his elbows while grease streaked across his hands and forearms. He looked calmer here than he had in the diner, more grounded somehow, but the exhaustion had not disappeared. It lived in the slight stiffness of his movements and the permanent tension in his shoulders like his body had forgotten how to fully rest years ago. One of the older mechanics noticed Bob first and straightened immediately. Can I help you? Before Bob could answer, Benjean looked up from the engine. The moment recognition hit his face, everything else in the garage seemed to pause for half a second. Bob saw surprise first, then confusion, then something sharper once Benjean noticed the black SUV parked outside and the expensive coat Bob wore despite trying not to stand out. You came all the way here? Benjean asked while wiping his hands with a rag. I wanted to talk to you. Benjean glanced briefly toward the office, as if checking whether someone else might overhear before nodding once. Give me a minute. Bob used that short wait to look around properly. The place was struggling. He had already known that from the reports his assistant gathered, but seeing it in person made the situation feel heavier somehow. The lifts were outdated. Half the equipment needed replacing. The office computers were nearly ancient. And yet every mechanic here still worked carefully instead of rushing through repairs for profit. That alone told Bob more about Benjean than any background check ever could. When Benjean finally approached, he still smelled faintly of motor oil beneath his alpha pheromones, and for one deeply irritating moment Bob became aware of how quickly his body relaxed around that scent now. You could have called, Benjean said quietly. You never gave me your number. A small pause followed before Benjean gestured toward the office. Come inside. The office was cramped and cluttered with invoices, coffee stains, old repair manuals, and years of exhaustion pressed into every corner. Bob remained standing near the desk while Benjin closed the door behind them. Up close, the alpha looked uneasy in a way he had not inside the diner. Bob understood why almost immediately. Benjin had recognized his name. "I looked you up," Benjin admitted first, crossing his arms tightly across his chest. "After the diner." Bob nodded once. "I figured. You're Bob Hart." There was no accusation in his voice yet, but there was distance now, sharp and immediate. Bob hated that more than he expected. "You say that like it changes something." "It changes a lot," Benjin replied quietly. "People like you don't end up in roadside diners alone at 6 in the morning." Bob leaned slightly against his crutch. "People like me still need coffee." "That's not what I meant." "No," Bob answered calmly. "It isn't." Silence settled heavily between them then, because both of them understood the real meaning beneath those words. Wealth changed how people treated omegas. Power changed it even more. Bob spent most of his life surrounded by individuals who bowed politely while calculating how useful he could be to them. Money protected him from certain dangers, but created entirely different ones in return. Benjin looked away first. "So why are you here?" Bob reached into the leather folder tucked beneath his arm and placed several documents carefully across the desk. "Your garage is 2 months from foreclosure. Your debt is high enough that the bank's already preparing asset liquidation options. You're surviving month to month, and unless something changes soon, this place is gone." The moment the words left his mouth, tension flooded the room. Benjin's jaw tightened instantly. "You investigated me. I investigate every investment opportunity. I'm not an investment." Bob met his gaze directly. "I think you could be." For a second, genuine confusion flickered across Benjin's expression before suspicion replaced it again. "You're serious?" "Yes." Benjin gave a quiet, humorless laugh and stepped backward toward the window. "You know, for about 5 minutes after we met, I actually thought maybe you were normal." The words landed harder than Bob expected. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" "It means people with your kind of money don't walk into places like this unless they want something." Benjin gestured around the office sharply. "So what is it? Good publicity? Some charity project for your company? Look at the generous Omega CEO saving the poor garage alpha." "That's not why I'm here." "Then why?" Bob stayed silent for too long. Because the truth sounded dangerously close to weakness. Because ever since that diner, he could not stop thinking about this alpha who apologized for not protecting him sooner. Because the memory of Benjin crouching beside him instead of standing over him replayed constantly in his head. Because his body calmed every time Benjin's scent touched the air. And because for the first time in years, Bob had met someone who looked at him without calculation behind their eyes. "I want to expand this place," Bob said finally, forcing his voice steady. "Your location is good. The customer loyalty is strong. You already have the trust of this town. I can fund renovations, equipment, staff expansion. You'd run operations as a partner." Benjin stared at him like he had stopped speaking a language either of them understood. "You can't be serious." "I don't make jokes about business." "That's exactly the problem," Benjin shot back. "This isn't business and you know it." Bob's patience thinned slightly. "Then tell me what you think it is." "I think you feel guilty about the diner, and now you're trying to repay some imaginary debt." The words snapped something sharp inside Bob's chest. "You think this is pity?" "I think this is dangerous." Bob's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. "You know what's dangerous? Spending your entire life acting like you have to survive everything alone because the second someone offers help, you assume they're trying to own you." Benjin's expression hardened immediately. "And you know what rich alphas and omegas do all the time? They buy people. They decide someone's life would look prettier under their control and call it generosity." "That's not what I'm doing." "Then what are you doing?" Bob opened his mouth, stopped, then laughed once under his breath because suddenly the truth hurt too much to say cleanly. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "Maybe he looked away briefly before forcing himself to continue. "Maybe I just wanted one person to stay." The room went completely silent. Benjin's expression changed instantly. Not shock. Not victory. Understanding. And somehow that was worse. Bob hated the sudden tightness in his throat. He hated that this alpha could stand there covered in grease and exhaustion and still make him feel more exposed than boardrooms full of predators ever had. "Forget it," Bob muttered while reaching for his crutch. Clearly this was a mistake. He turned too quickly. Pain shot violently through his injured leg, throwing his balance sideways before he could recover properly. Benjin moved immediately. One arm caught Bob around the waist before he hit the floor, while the other steadied the crutch slipping from his grip. The contact slammed heat through both of them so suddenly that Bob froze. Alpha pheromones surged hard enough to thicken the air. Not aggressive. Protective. Instinctive. Benjin lowered him carefully against the desk instead of letting go immediately. His breathing had changed. Bob could hear it now, rougher than before. Then Benjin dropped to one knee. Without a word, he reached toward the loosened strap along Bob's prosthetic and adjusted it carefully with rough grease-stained fingers. Movements unexpectedly gentle despite the tension radiating from him. "Don't force yourself to stand when you're hurting," Benjin said quietly while tightening the strap properly. "You don't have to keep pretending everything's fine every second." Bob stared down at him silently. No one had touched his prosthetic that gently in years. No one. When Benjin finally looked up, their faces were suddenly too close. Bob could feel the restraint pouring off him now, sharp and brutal and barely controlled. And for the first time since the diner, Benjin looked genuinely afraid. Not of Bob. Of himself. His voice dropped lower. "You should go before I forget how to keep my instincts under control." Bob's pulse stumbled hard against his ribs. Because the terrifying part was that some small selfish piece of him did not want to leave at all. Benjin accepted the partnership 3 days later, though he did it with the expression of a man signing papers that might either save his life or destroy it completely. Bob noticed the hesitation immediately when they sat across from each other in the conference room at Heart Biotech headquarters, but he said nothing about it because the truth was that he understood hesitation better than most people. Trust had never come easily to either of them, and asking an alpha who had spent years surviving alone to suddenly step into the world of billion-dollar corporations was almost cruel in its own way. Still, Benjin signed the contract in the end, his rough fingers steady against the expensive pen while the city skyline reflected across the glass walls behind him. "You still have time to change your mind," Benjin muttered after pushing the paperwork back across the table. Bob looked up from the final page. "So do you?" Benjin gave a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "That's what worries me." The first 2 weeks were rough in ways neither of them fully expected. Benjin understood engines, repairs, inventory systems, and exhausted customers trying to keep their lives together through broken cars. But corporate structures felt like a foreign language designed specifically to suffocate people. Bob's executives were polite on the surface, though several of them clearly hated the idea of a garage alpha suddenly becoming part of expansion discussions. Bob noticed every glance, every carefully hidden reaction, and every slight pause before someone addressed Benjin directly instead of looking toward him first. The rumors started almost immediately after the partnership became public. An Omega CEO letting an alpha too close to company operations was already enough to make shareholders nervous. But the moment tabloids learned Benjin had been seen escorting Bob out of the office late at night after strategy meetings, speculation exploded across social media. "He's using pheromones to manipulate him. No Omega would risk this much money unless there was bonding involved. He's military. Of course he's dangerous." Bob read exactly 3 articles before closing the tablet hard enough to crack the corner of the screen. Benjin found him in his office 30 minutes later staring silently out the window while suppressor pills sat untouched beside a cold cup of coffee. "You shouldn't skip your medication because you're angry," Benjin said quietly after stepping inside. Bob did not turn around immediately. "I wasn't aware you monitored my prescriptions now. I monitor the fact you look like you haven't slept properly in days." The irritation in Bob's chest weakened slightly at that, because Benjin said things like that too naturally now, like caring had become instinctive before either of them realized it. Over the past weeks, their routines had begun weaving together in small, quiet ways neither fully acknowledged. Benjin remembered exactly how Bob took his coffee. Bob knew which shoulder hurt more when the weather changed. Benjin automatically slowed his walking pace whenever Bob's legs stiffened, and Bob had stopped pretending not to notice when Benjin positioned himself between him and crowded elevators full of aggressive alpha pheromones. The dangerous part was how natural all of it felt. One evening after a particularly brutal board meeting, Bob remained in the office long after everyone else had gone home, while rain hammered against the city windows hard enough to blur the skyline into streaks of silver and black. The suppressor headache pounding behind his eyes had started hours earlier, but he ignored it the same way he ignored most problems involving his own body. He was reviewing expansion budgets when his vision suddenly blurred badly enough that he missed an entire line of numbers. Then the scent hit him. Sweetness spread sharply through the room before Bob could stop it. His breathing caught instantly. "No," he whispered under his breath while fumbling for the suppressor bottle in his drawer. His hands shook too badly to open it properly. The heat instability had been getting worse for months, but never this fast. Never this suddenly. Panic climbed violently into his chest because the office building was still occupied, and one uncontrolled omega pheromone release in a corporate tower full of alphas could turn dangerous in seconds. Bob forced himself upright too quickly, nearly stumbling when pain shot through his injured leg, and grabbed his crutch before making it halfway toward the private elevator. His body already felt too warm, his heartbeat uneven beneath his ribs while instinct screamed at him to find somewhere safe before the scent intensified further. The elevator doors opened downstairs into the underground parking garage, nearly empty at that hour, except for one familiar truck parked several rows away. Benjean looked up immediately the moment Bob emerged. Every trace of calm disappeared from his face. Bob barely managed 2 more steps before his knees weakened sharply beneath him. Benjean crossed the distance fast enough that Bob barely processed movement before strong hands steadied his shoulders. "Hey," Benjean said sharply but carefully. "Look at me." Bob's breathing was turning ragged now. "Go," he forced out. "You need to stay away from me." The alpha scent surrounding Benjean had already shifted, deeper and heavier beneath the surface restraint. But instead of stepping back, Benjean lowered himself into a crouch directly in front of him so Bob would not have to tilt his head upward. "I'm not leaving you here like this. You don't understand." Bob shut his eyes briefly against another wave of heat crashing through him. "My suppressors aren't working properly." Benjean went very still after hearing that. Most alphas would react badly to an omega in heat. Some became aggressive. Others became possessive. Even good men sometimes lost themselves once instinct fully took over. That fear had followed Bob his entire life. But Benjean only asked quietly, "What do you need?" The question nearly broke something inside him. Bob's fingers tightened weakly against Benjean's jacket sleeve. "Don't look at me right now." Silence followed for half a second. Then Benjean moved even closer instead of farther away. "I always look at you," he said softly. Bob's breath shook. Benjean carefully pulled him against his chest before the trembling in Bob's body worsened further. One arm firm around his back, while controlled alpha pheromones slowly spread through the underground garage. Not dominance. Not possession. Stabilization. Bob realized with terrifying clarity that his body trusted this alpha completely. Benjean rested his forehead lightly against Bob's hair while speaking in the same calm, steady tone he used during dangerous situations. "Breathe slower," he murmured. "You're okay. I've got you." No one had said words like that to Bob in years. Not without wanting something afterward. His fingers curled instinctively into Benjean's shirt while heat and exhaustion blurred together inside his chest. He could hear the alpha's heartbeat clearly now, steady despite the tension radiating beneath his restraint. Benjean was struggling too. Bob knew that. The scent compatibility between them had become impossible to ignore. Yet he still had not crossed a single line. That restraint felt more intimate than touch. By the time Bob's breathing finally stabilized enough for coherent thought, nearly 20 minutes had passed. Benjean still held him carefully against his chest like letting go too soon might shatter something fragile between them. And maybe it already had. Because when Bob slowly pulled back enough to meet his eyes, he realized something terrifying. He no longer wanted to survive this world alone. Before either of them could speak, another scent entered the parking garage. Sharp. Expensive. Dominant. A tall alpha stepped from the elevator with cold amusement already visible across his face the moment he noticed the position they were in. "Well," the alpha drawled smoothly while looking directly at Bob. "I leave town for 6 months, and suddenly you're letting strays touch you." The temperature in the underground parking garage seemed to drop the moment the new alpha stepped closer, his expensive shoes echoing sharply across the concrete, while the scent of dominance rolled through the air with practiced confidence. Bob stiffened immediately against Benjean's chest, and that single reaction was enough to make something dark shift inside the alpha still holding him. Benjean felt it instantly. Fear. Not panic exactly, but the kind of instinctive tension that came from someone who had learned through experience exactly how dangerous certain men could become behind closed doors. The newcomer stopped several feet away, hands tucked casually into the pockets of his tailored coat, while his gaze moved slowly across the scene in front of him. "You look terrible, Bob," he said smoothly. "I warned you years ago that overusing suppressors would eventually destroy your body." Benjin's jaw tightened slightly. "Who are you?" The alpha ignored him completely. That alone told Benjin enough. "I asked you a question," he repeated, voice lower this time. Finally the man glanced toward him with visible irritation. "Kane Laurent." His eyes narrowed faintly afterward. "And you must be the garage alpha everyone suddenly can't stop talking about." Bob pushed himself upright before the situation escalated further, though his hand remained curled weakly around Benjin's sleeve for balance longer than he realized. "Kane," he said coldly. "What are you doing here?" "I came back for a board meeting and found out my favorite Omega is apparently causing corporate scandals with a mechanic." Kane's smile never reached his eyes. "Naturally, I got curious." The insult landed hard enough that Benjin's pheromones shifted dangerously beneath the surface control he was forcing onto himself. Bob felt it immediately. The air around them thickened. Not violent yet, but close. Too close. "Watch your tone," Benjin said quietly. Kane laughed softly. "Interesting. You actually think this is your place." Before Benjin could answer, Bob stepped forward despite the lingering weakness still visible in his posture. "Enough," he said sharply. "You don't get to walk in after months away and start acting like you own anything here." For the first time, irritation flickered clearly across Kane's face. "You always mistake concern for control." "No," Bob replied. "I mistake control for control." Silence stretched tightly between them. Benjin understood enough already to recognize history when he saw it. Not romance exactly. Something uglier. The kind of relationship built on pressure instead of trust. Kane looked at Bob the way wealthy alphas often looked at high-status omegas. Valuable, difficult, but ultimately expected to belong somewhere eventually. And Benjin hated it immediately. Kane's gaze drifted briefly toward the hand Bob still had against Benjin's jacket, before his expression hardened almost invisibly. "Your pheromones are unstable," he said. "Come with me before you embarrass yourself further." Bob's entire posture went rigid. "I said no. And I'm saying your judgment is compromised right now." Benjin moved before he fully realized he was doing it, stepping slightly in front of Bob with controlled slowness that somehow felt more threatening than aggression. "He answered you already." Kane stared at him for several long seconds, then smiled again in that cold, polished way people used when deciding someone beneath them was no longer worth direct engagement. "Careful," he murmured. "Some instincts become addictions faster than alphas realize." Then he walked away. The second the elevator doors closed behind him, Bob's shoulders finally loosened slightly, though exhaustion still lingered heavily across his face. Benjin turned immediately. "You okay?" Bob gave a humorless laugh under his breath. "Apparently I attract controlling alphas professionally. That man wants ownership, not partnership." The words came out rougher than Benjin intended. Bob looked at him carefully after hearing that. "You figured that out fast." "I've spent enough time around military command structures to recognize when someone mistakes power for entitlement." For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Bob quietly said, "Kane was one of Heart Biotech's original investors years ago. He pushed hard for a political marriage bond arrangement after my accident because he thought the company needed an alpha face to stabilize public confidence." His mouth tightened faintly afterward. "When I refused, he took it personally." Benjin felt anger settle low and dangerous in his chest. "Did he ever hurt you?" Bob hesitated for half a second too long. That answer alone was enough. Before Benjin could push further, Bob straightened carefully and stepped back just enough to put space between them again. "You should go home," he said softly. "You've already done enough tonight." The problem was that Benjin no longer knew how to walk away from him. That realization only got worse over the following weeks. The garage expansion moved forward despite constant pressure from shareholders and gossip media, but the attacks became more personal after Kane's return. First came vandalism. 3 company vehicles had their tires slashed overnight, while anti-Omega slurs were spray painted across the outer garage wall. Then anonymous articles appeared online accusing Bob of allowing pheromone favoritism to influence company leadership appointments. Benjin wanted to pretend the comments did not affect him, but every time he saw Bob quietly reading those headlines with exhausted eyes and rigid posture, something violent twisted deeper inside his chest. It reached its breaking point one rainy evening nearly a month later. Bob had attended a private investor dinner despite Benjean arguing against it from the start. Kane's going to be there, he warned earlier that afternoon while standing in Bob's office doorway. You already know what kind of games he plays. I can handle Kane. That's not what worries me. Bob looked up then, expression softening slightly at the tension he heard underneath those words. You can't protect me from every unpleasant alpha in the world, Benjean. The alpha's jaw tightened. Maybe not. Doesn't mean I stop wanting to. Bob still went to the dinner. And 3 hours later, Benjean received the phone call. By the time he arrived at the hotel rooftop lounge, every instinct inside him was already screaming danger. The scent hit him first before he even reached the private room. Omega pheromones. Distressed. Unstable. Bob. Benjean shoved the doors open hard enough that several people inside startled immediately. Bob sat rigidly against the couch near the windows, breathing uneven while Kane crouched beside him with one hand gripping his wrist too tightly. Wine glasses sat untouched across the table, but the scent flooding the room told Benjean exactly what happened. Someone had tampered with Bob's suppressors. Kane stood slowly once he noticed him. You're overreacting. Benjean barely heard the words. All he saw was Bob struggling to breathe properly while panic flickered behind carefully controlled eyes. And suddenly the room was no longer a hotel. For one brutal second, it became war again. Blood. Gunfire. Teammates screaming. Failure. Benjean's body moved automatically before his mind caught up. He crossed the room in seconds, grabbing Kane by the front of his shirt hard enough to slam him backward against the wall. Gasps erupted around them, but Benjean barely registered any of it. Alpha pheromones exploded violently through the room, crushing enough that weaker alphas immediately backed away. Kane actually smiled despite the pressure around his throat. There he is, he rasped. The real alpha. Benjean's hand tightened instinctively. One more second. One more movement. That was all it would take. Then Bob's voice cut through the haze. Benjean. Everything stopped. Benjean froze completely. Bob sat there trembling slightly from destabilized pheromones, yet his eyes stayed locked on Benjean instead of Kane. Not afraid. Never afraid of him. And somehow that hurt worse. Slowly, painfully, Benjean released Kane's shirt and stepped backward. The entire room stared at him in stunned silence. His breathing sounded rough now, uneven beneath the crushing effort of restraint. He remembered every terrible thing people used to say about military alphas. Violent. Unstable. Dangerous once provoked. He spent years terrified those instincts were true. Kane adjusted his collar with visible satisfaction. See, he murmured toward Bob. This is why Omegas need controlled environments. Something inside Benjean nearly snapped again. But before he could move, Bob stood. His legs shook slightly from the lingering suppressor interference, but his voice remained steady. No, Bob said quietly. This is why I chose him. The room went silent. Bob crossed the distance between them slowly before stopping directly in front of Benjean. Then, without hesitation, he reached up and grabbed the front of Benjean's jacket tightly between trembling fingers. Benjean stared down at him, breathing hard. Bob's voice dropped softer. You always try to leave when things get ugly, he whispered. Are you going to leave me too? Something broke open inside Benjean then, sharp and devastating. He lowered his forehead carefully against Bob's and shut his eyes briefly. I don't want to own you, he said quietly, rough honesty cutting through every instinct clawing beneath his skin. I just want you safe. Bob's fingers tightened against his jacket. Then, before Benjean could pull away again, Bob kissed him. Soft. Shaking. Not driven by heat or pheromones. Just trust. And for the first time in years, Benjean kissed someone without feeling like a weapon. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but it changed something fundamental between them so completely that neither Bob nor Benjean could pretend afterward that this was still just partnership, protection, or pheromone compatibility. The rooftop lounge remained painfully quiet around them after Bob pulled back slightly. Several investors and executives still frozen in stunned silence, while rain streaked across the windows behind the city skyline. But none of that mattered anymore because Benjean was looking at him like the entire world had shifted under his feet. There was no hunger in his expression, no triumph, no possessiveness, only raw disbelief mixed with something dangerously soft that made Bob's chest ache harder than the destabilized heat still lingering beneath his skin. Kane recovered first. This is exactly why Omegas shouldn't make decisions while emotionally compromised, he said coldly while adjusting his sleeve. You're proving every concern the board already has. Bob finally turned toward him fully, and for the first time since they met years ago, Kane visibly lost control of the conversation because the Omega in front of him no longer looked exhausted, uncertain, or cornered. He looked furious. No, Bob answered quietly. What I'm proving is that I'm tired of powerful alphas deciding what my choices are supposed to mean. Kane's jaw tightened. You think this ends well? A former military alpha with control issues attached to the most visible Omega CEO in the country. Benjin immediately stepped back half a pace after hearing that because shame still lived too deep inside him to ignore words like those completely. But before distance could form properly between them, Bob reached out and caught his wrist firmly. The contact stunned both of them. Bob had spent most of his life avoiding public physical affection because the world always interpreted Omega vulnerability as invitation. Yet now he stood in front of an entire room full of executives while holding on to Benjin openly. You don't get to talk about him like that, Bob said without releasing his grip. Especially not after what you just did to me. Several people around the room shifted uneasily after hearing that sentence. Kane noticed it too. Careful, he warned softly. False accusations destroy reputations. So does drugging someone's suppressors at a business dinner. The silence afterward felt lethal. Benjin looked sharply toward Bob, but the Omega did not break eye contact with Kane once. You made one mistake tonight, Bob continued quietly. You assumed I'd still stay silent just because you embarrassed me publicly. For the first time all evening, Kane looked genuinely uncertain. Bob finally released Benjin's wrist then and pulled his phone from his pocket before sliding it across the nearest table. The security footage from the hotel hallway has already been forwarded to my legal team, he said calmly, along with witness statements from the waiter you paid to switch my medication. Kane's face went still. Get out, Bob finished softly. Nobody moved for several seconds. Then Kane laughed once under his breath, though the sound carried no amusement anymore. You really are willing to burn bridges for him. Bob looked toward Benjin briefly before answering. No. I'm finally willing to stop letting people treat me like something they can own. Kane left 5 minutes later surrounded by silence sharp enough to cut skin. The moment the elevator doors closed behind him, the tension draining from Bob's body hit all at once. His breathing faltered slightly, exhaustion crashing hard now that adrenaline no longer held him upright. Benjin noticed immediately and stepped closer without thinking. Hey, he said quietly. Sit down before you fall over. Bob actually laughed weakly at that before allowing Benjin to guide him carefully toward the couch again. This time nobody in the room said a word about the alpha touching him. 2 weeks later, Kane officially resigned from Heart Biotech's board after legal investigations quietly began behind closed doors. Publicly, the company described it as a voluntary transition. Privately, everyone understood exactly what happened. Bob could have destroyed him completely if he wanted to, but he chose not to. When Benjin asked why one evening while they worked late inside the newly renovated garage office, Bob stayed silent for a long moment before answering. Because I'm tired of surviving by becoming crueler than everyone else. The garage looked entirely different now compared to the morning Bob first arrived there months earlier. New lifts had been installed. The office windows were replaced. Additional staff moved through the bays during the day, while customers filled the waiting area almost constantly. But the most important thing had not changed. People still trusted the place. Veterans came by even when they did not need repairs just to drink coffee and talk. Young Omega's training in mechanical programs now interned safely there without worrying about harassment. For the first time in years, Benjin walked through the garage without feeling like he was watching his father's legacy slowly die. Yet despite all of that progress, there was still one conversation neither of them had fully finished. It happened late at night after the last mechanic left. Snow drifted quietly outside while soft music played from an old radio near the office desk. Bob sat on the couch reviewing expansion proposals with his prosthetic removed for comfort, one crutch leaning nearby while fatigue softened the sharp edges of his usual composure. Benjin watched him silently from across the room for several seconds before finally speaking. There's something we still haven't talked about. Bob glanced up immediately because the tone in Benjin's voice carried unusual tension. The kiss. Benjin looked briefly away. The bond. Silence settled softly between them. Most Alpha and Omega relationships moved toward marking naturally once pheromone compatibility became this intense. Society expected it. Biology practically encouraged it. But neither of them had crossed that line yet, despite how deeply intertwined their lives had become. Bob set the paperwork aside slowly. You don't want it? Benjin crossed the office before stopping directly in front of him. That's not the problem. His voice dropped lower afterward, rough honesty settling into every word. I want it too much. Bob's chest tightened painfully. Benjin crouched carefully in front of him then, the same way he had in the diner months ago, bringing himself to eye level instead of towering above him. I spent years terrified of becoming the kind of alpha who hurts people because instinct matters more than choice, he admitted quietly. And if I mark you, I need to know it's because you chose me, not because your body decided I'm safe. Something inside Bob cracked softly at those words, because no alpha had ever offered him that kind of freedom before. Most treated bonding like inevitable ownership. Benjin treated it like trust. Bob reached forward slowly until his fingers touched the side of Benjin's face. You still don't understand, do you? He whispered. Benjin frowned faintly. I already chose you. The look on Benjin's face after hearing that nearly stole the breath from his lungs. Bob leaned forward first this time, resting his forehead gently against Benjin's while snow continued falling quietly outside the garage windows. I'm tired of hiding from what I am, he admitted softly. I'm tired of acting like needing someone makes me weak. Benjin's hand slid carefully against the back of his neck then, warm and steady and impossibly gentle. It doesn't. The marking happened slowly after that. Not desperate. Not violent. Nothing like the terrifying stories Omegas often grew up hearing. Benjin kissed him first, soft enough that Bob could still pull away if he wanted to, and when his teeth finally pressed carefully against the scent gland beneath Bob's jaw, the feeling that rushed through both of them felt less like possession and more like finally reaching somewhere safe after years of wandering alone. Months later, the first snow of winter returned to the city. The garage lights still glowed warmly against the dark while mechanics worked late finishing repairs before closing. Inside the office, Bob had fallen asleep sideways on the couch beneath Benjin's heavy jacket, while paperwork remained scattered across his lap unfinished. The bond scent between them now lingered naturally through the room, calm and familiar and deeply comforting in ways Bob once thought impossible. One of the younger mechanics walked past the office doorway before stopping with a grin. Boss, he called softly toward Benjin. You seriously planning to stay here all night again? Benjin glanced up briefly from the engine manual in his hands before looking back toward the sleeping Omega curled beneath his jacket. Then he smiled quietly. No, he answered. I'm already home. And so, on a cold winter night inside a garage built from second chances, two people who once believed they had to survive alone finally found a place to belong. Thank you for listening to this story, and if you enjoyed the journey of Bob and Benjin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay for the next story.